Nous avons déjà parlé sur le podcast du postmodernisme, un mouvement philosophique qui a émergé lors de la seconde moitié du XXe siècle. Nous en avions discuté avec Graham et Garrant en relation avec la Gegenaufklärung. Nous avions aussi mentionné le climat actuel sur les campus universitaires britanniques. Il est clair que ces deux sujets sont liés. Mon invité pour cet épisode est Stephen R.C. Hicks. Stephen est professeur de philosophie à l'université de Rockford aux États-Unis et a écrit un livre détaillant la généalogie intellectuelle du postmodernisme. Nous discutons du livre, de la conquête de l'Amérique par le postmodernisme, de son influence sur la mission et la nature de l'université. We already talked on the show about postmodernism, a philosophical movement that emerged in the second half of the 20th century. We talked about it with Graham Garrard in relation to the Counter-Enlightenment. We had also mentioned the current climate on British university campuses. It should be clear that these two topics are linked. My guest this time is Stephen R.C. Hicks. Stephen is a professor of philosophy at Rockford University in Illinois, and he has written a book explaining the intellectual genealogy of postmodernism. We talk about the book, about how postmodernism conquered America, and how it influences the role and nature of the university. So, hi everyone. I'm very thrilled to be here with Professor Stephen Hicks. Stephen, you're a professor of philosophy at Rockford University, that's in Illinois.
Yes.
You graduated with your PhD in 1991 from Indiana University. The title of your dissertation was Foundationalism and the Genesis of Justification.
Yes.
You published several books, including Explaining Postmodernism in 2004 and Nietzsche and the Nazis in 2006. You're also a member of Heterodox Academy, which I'm pleased to say I joined very recently.
Ah, very good.
Yeah. And, our discussion today will mostly revolve around your first book, Explaining Postmodernism.
All right.
So maybe we can start with, it's not an easy question by any means, but a basic question. Maybe you could try and explain the central ideas of postmodernism in a few sentences for the uninitiated, if you will.
Okay. Only a few sentences, huh?
Mm-hmm.
That's a challenge.
If possible.
All right. All right. So what I would say the most important ones, we'll just mention three. First is that modernism is taken as the contrast to postmodernism. So the idea we are rejecting or moving beyond modernism. So then if you ask what the core ideas of modernism are, one certainly is that we should understand the natural world or the physical world of matter and energy as our fundamental taking off point. Mm-hmm. And that's our fundamental object of study, and that we need to come to understand it in its own terms. And that was already a break from kind of older religious philosophy or older dualist philosophy that saw the natural physical world in some sense as derivative, from a higher, non-physical, perhaps a spiritual world. Mm. Now, postmodernism then is a fundamental rejection of modernism in the sense that it takes what we call an anti-realist position. That is to say that we can't speak meaningfully or significantly about what the nature of an external, physical, natural reality, would be. Mm-hmm. And so in all of the major variations of postmodern thought, you get a retreat from the idea of an independently existing natural reality to the idea that what we call reality is in some sense a construct, a social construct.
Yes.
So that's one. The second idea important to modernism was an epistemological point that if we're going to acquire knowledge is important to us. It takes a great deal of effort, and that what we need to do is understand the world through reason. Now, there might be more empiricist versions of reason or more rationalistic versions of reason.
Yes.
But the modernists were revolutionary in rejecting the idea that we should take anything on faith, either faith in traditions or faith in various authoritative institutions, or faith in certain scriptures that were said to be communicated to prophets or mystics, way back in time. So fundamental then is a commitment to understanding the world rationally. And again, the postmodernists are then rejecting that idea, right, fundamentally. What they'll argue is that there is no such thing as reason, right, or that reason itself is constructed in various forms based on various people's group identities. Perhaps those group identities are racial or gender-oriented or ethnically based or whatever. But you end up in a kind of fundamental non-rationalism, right, shading into irrationalism.
Yes.
Third point I would say is kind of a broad value point. What's characteristic of modern philosophy, and then by extension, right, modern value branches, is an idea of human rights, the value and worth of every individual, that we should believe in certain universal moral principles of freedom, the pursuit of happiness, various forms of equality, that everyone is worthy of a fundamental dignity that should be respected, and that if we treat each other that way, we will eliminate slavery, will eliminate the second-class citizen of the status of women, we'll get along with people of different religions, and we can work things out in kind of mutually beneficial, peaceful ways. Now, that optimism, right, about our basic value commitments and our prospects for peaceful and progressive solutions is also something that is fundamentally, right, rejected by the postmoderns. What they replace that with is typically an idea that people are divided into groups, that those groups have very different identities that are in conflict with each other. But because we've rejected rational understanding fundamentally, the only way these groups are going to sort out their differences is going to be through, at best, contentious methods, or perhaps outright conflict and battle methods. And there's not going to be, so to speak, a progressive solution that's possible.
Yes.
All right, so we end up with the idea in the strongest forms, that reality is just a social construct, right, of some sort, that we can't understand it, right, rationally, and human relations are going to be basically nasty and conflictual.
Okay.
So I think that was more than a few sentences, but those would be the three basic points I would emphasize.
Okay, very good. So, if I look at the subtitle of your book, you chose the subtitle Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault. So, It's not entirely clear. Maybe, for me it is because I read your book, but for people who have not, it might not be entirely clear how that connects with what you just explained, actually. So, could you explain why you chose this subtitle to characterize the intellectual genealogy, so to say, of postmodernism?
Right. So the two abstract concepts there are skepticism, right, which is an epistemological concept, and then socialism, which is a kind of a normative kind of values and politics concept. And then the two names are mentioned, Rousseau and Foucault. They are giants in the history of intellectual life.
Yes.
Rousseau in the mid-18th century, I chose him as the starting figure, and then chose Foucault as the kind of capstone thinker in the postmodern, right, tradition. So the idea is that if you want to understand postmodernism, it's a big, sprawling intellectual movement and you can't, capture it simply one-dimensionally. Instead, it has some things to say about metaphysics and epistemology, human nature, values, and so forth, all the big questions that we think about. And the skepticism part is that on all of the big questions, the postmodernism amounts to an integration of all of the skeptical trends in philosophy and intellectual life over the last 2 centuries or so. So from the great optimistic era of the Enlightenment, right,
Yes.
which was arguing that we can come to know the world and then use that knowledge to improve the human condition. There's a counter-enlightenment that begins, and then much of the intellectual world, particularly in the humanities, becomes increasingly skeptical, right, over the generations, until by the time you get to the mid to the latter half of the 20th century, much of the humanities is in a very skeptical way. So part of the story is talking how, starting with Rousseau, but then more seriously in Hume, and then even more seriously, I argue, in Kant, all mid, late 1700s thinkers. The skeptical turn, right, takes hold, and then it's so to speak, a downward slide until you end up with postmodernism. The socialism side, right, of the equation is also important because, if you're just a skeptic, you think that knowledge is not possible, right, and so forth, then that all by itself is not going to predict any particular value orientation.
Yes.
You would expect people who are skeptics, if everything is just subjective preferences and so forth, then there could be all sorts of skeptical preferences that people will adopt. What's very interesting about the postmoderns, if you think of all of the first generation leading thinkers, again, Foucault and Jacques Derrida and Lyotard and Richard Rorty. And, the claim I actually make, if you were to identify the top 50 first generation postmodernists, all of them are very left wing in their political orientation. So there is and all of that then gets packaged with the postmodern system, right, overall. So then there's a question of how that particular political orientation, right, comes to be integrated with these very skeptical philosophical ideas. And again, if we go back to Rousseau, one of the things, of course, that's characteristic of Rousseau is that he is very hostile to traditional feudal structure. Writing in mid 18th century France, which is still highly feudal. There's an intellectual revolution underway, but it's still confined largely to the intellectuals, the philosophes. Rousseau is opposed both to the traditional feudal political and economic arrangements, but also opposed to what he's aware of as kind of emerging market-oriented, individualistic, liberal politics. So he's an early advocate of a kind of communitarian, an authoritarian communalism, kind of an early socialism, right, of a sort. And then what, of course, comes to dominate practical political and economic affairs in the Western world with the collapse of feudalism in the 1700s is, broadly speaking, liberal, free market, democratic, republican kinds of political institutions. But the Rousseauian line runs from Rousseau on through Marx and then on into the 20th century. Brands of left-wing thought has always been consistently opposed to liberal, free market, democratic republicanism. So the story of how left-wing thought, particularly far left-wing thought, evolved is also important. So the big claim I'm making then, hence the subtitle, right, of the book, is that by the time you get to the 1950s, that's the generation in which Michel Foucault is finishing his PhD work and launching himself as a young intellectual. Jacques Derrida, Jean-Francois Lyotard, Richard Rorty, and so all of them are young, highly intelligent men graduating and entering the profession in the 1950s. All of them are getting PhDs in philosophy with very rigorous educations in kind of up to speed epistemological issues and philosophy of science and philosophy of language issues. Foucault also has a PhD in psychology. And so they are very well versed in the very skeptical conclusions that professional philosophy is reaching mid-century. At the same time, as young men, they are all very strongly committed to left-wing thought. They were all Marxists in varying degrees, with the exception of Rorty, who's kind of a far left-wing social democrat. But at that point, left-wing thought is reaching a crisis, because it's now about a century after Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. The revolution has not come. It seems like all of the predictions about how capitalism was going to develop that Marx and Engels had made had failed to materialize. Capitalism seemed to be doing very well and getting stronger. So there was a great deal of demoralization, right, among the left by the time we get to the 1950s. So there's a kind of crisis of thought. Other important thing that happened in the 50s was involved the Soviet Union, in the 1920s, 1930s, in the 1940s. It's a little bit hard for us to imagine this now, but there was great excitement, admiration among left-wing thinkers for the experiment going on in the Soviet Union. Right, that the Soviet Union was going to become extremely prosperous, and that as a kind of socialist communist regime, that it cared about the people, it cared about the workers, it was humane. But by the time we got to the 1950s, it was very clear that the Soviet Union was a very brutal regime, right? Internally, that its economy was failing to be productive, and this caused a crisis for intellectually honest people on the far left. And so the claim then is that postmodernism, this first generation of postmodernism, is an integration then of the skeptical arguments with a new strategy for how to argue for left-wing thought. So skepticism and socialism from Rousseau to Foucault. That's the story.
I see. So in your book, however, you also speak of postmodernism. How postmodernism was influenced as well by Counter-Enlightenment philosophy from the right. So could you also describe this?
Yeah, that's a very striking thing. If you think about one way of dividing up the political spectrum, it's to say there's the far left and there's the far right, and to portray them as deep enemies. And I think that's there obviously you can make some points about ways in which they are opposed to each other, but they are always opposed only on secondary issues. So if you think, for example, of someone like Kant or Hegel, in their political philosophies, they're typically categorized as right-wing thinkers. But we do know that Hegelian thought also took a left-wing form, and that Marx represents a left-wing variation on Hegelianism. If you think of thinkers who came to prominence in the 20th century, someone like Marcuse was very comfortable working in the Heideggerian philosophical tradition. And Heidegger, ended up being a Nazi, and according to that political spectrum, that puts him on the right. But then at the same time, Marcuse is comfortable integrating that quasi-Heideggerian approach with traditional left-wing Marxist or neo-Marxist, right, kinds of thought. Or if you think of someone like Carl Schmitt, political thinker of the 20s right, and 30s, typically classified as an extreme right-wing thinker, and again, a supporter right of the Nazis. But by the time you get to the 1980s and the 1990s, it's a very striking thing that many of the left-wing postmodern thinkers are the ones who are rehabilitating Carl Schmitt and incorporating many of his insights into their work. So the point that I make is that the what we call the far right and the far left are in fact both anti-liberal philosophies, and that they're variations on authoritarianism, they're variations on anti-individualism, they're both fundamentally anti-rational. They both believe that conflict, violence between groups is the way that we're going to solve our problems, if we're going to solve them at all. And so what you find is, any of the far right thinkers and any of the far left thinkers, they have nothing but disdain for the classically liberal thinkers. They hate Locke, they hate Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Ayn Rand in the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek, and so forth. So I think the better way is to say, at one end of the spectrum, you need to have the liberals, right, who are individualistic, pro-peace, right, pro-trade, pro-people working things out in reasonable ways, and then various forms of authoritarianism, which typically divide people into groups, put those groups in conflict with each other, and say fundamentally that in kind of non-rational, violent ways we're going to sort out our problems. And then you have just kind of fascist, communist, and violent socialist variations on those themes.
Okay. One thing that is still somewhat unclear to me, I mean, it's not unclear because of your book, but it's something I've been wondering a lot about, is how fast the ideas of the French postmodernists were able to, take hold in the American universities, actually. That is quite a spectacular phenomenon to me. So you've argued, I mean, at least to some extent, that one reason for this is that the academic left in the US was in need of a renewal of their worldview. There is another hypothesis which was put forward in Alan David Bloom's book. I'm sure you know about it, The Closing of the American Mind.
Sorry, Alan Bloom? Yes.
Yes,
sure.
So his thesis was that the American spirit had been sort of prepared for the French postmodernists because America was already familiar with the ideas of thinkers like Max Weber and Friedrich Nietzsche. But I wonder really what would be your thoughts on, the spectacular success of the French postmodernists on American campuses.
Right. And I would say it's not only in American campuses. You find these also in Canadian universities, emerging from Canada, to some extent in British and Australia and New Zealand, right, universities.
Yeah, the whole Anglosphere, one can say.
Yeah, that's right. And what does make it striking is that for, until approximately the 1950s or the 1960s, the Anglo-American philosophical world was kind of contemptuous, you might say, of much of continental philosophy. So you didn't find much Hegelianism or Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or even the existentialists here. So my argument is that what happened is that the Anglo-American philosophical world kind of embraced positivism and logical positivism in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But by the time we got to the 1950s, that paradigm had collapsed.
Okay.
So it was, by the 1950s, in a very skeptical place. And what often happens is there's over the course of a generation or two, there's a new paradigm that comes along. And here we're using Thomas Kuhnian language. People are very excited and optimistic about it, but any flaws in the paradigm then get teased out and then taken to their extremes. Mm-hmm. And then that paradigm collapses, and then intellectuals are looking around for what the next new theory, right, is going to be. Okay. So there was a coincidence of timing that positivism and logical positivism are collapsing, right, in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So I believe Thomas Kuhn's book was published in 1962 or 1963, and with its very skeptical take on scientific method, yes, it's summarizing the skeptical trends that had been reached right at that point. So there's a vacuum, right, that exists in the intellectual world, or so to speak, in the Anglo-American, right, intellectual world, right, at that point. Pragmatism, kind of a semi-homegrown American philosophical system, William James, John Dewey, and others. And pragmatism also had reached somewhat skeptical state also by the 1950s and early 1960s. So someone like Richard Rorty comes out of that pragmatic tradition and thinks of himself as a neo-pragmatist, but seeing that tradition as reaching skeptical conclusions. So, there's the old saying that nature abhors a vacuum. And so one of the things that happens right at that point is whatever seems exciting and trendy can then more easily fill that vacuum. So at that point, the French philosophers, particularly existentialism, seems very sexy, very exotic, and many intellectuals, particularly younger intellectuals in the 50s and 60s, are attracted to existentialism. There's a certain amount of political unrest, yes. Obviously, the Korean War, the dissatisfaction with increasing involvement in Vietnam. Universities are becoming politicized. Yeah. So there's a combination of things that go on there. And so what you have, I think, is a generation of people who are being taught very skeptical ideas. At the same time, they are somewhat pessimistic, drawing on those existentialist trends. They're willing to reject the traditional Anglican or Anglo-American approaches as kind of old-fashioned and conservative. They're looking for something new and sexy, and they're in a rebellious phase. And so the postmodern package becomes very attractive at that point.
I see.
So it's a combination then of intellectual and sociological factors, I think, that come.
Okay, so I mean, building on this question, how different would you say that contemporary American postmodernism has become from French postmodernism? Would you say it's very different, or has it remained quite the same? And maybe if I can ask two questions at the same time. How aware would you say contemporary American postmodernists are that they are the intellectual heirs of Derrida or Heidegger?
Yeah, I would say the ones who get their PhDs and who are working actively, they are aware of Derrida, Foucault, right, and so forth. I think I've been a professor long enough that I have noticed that younger professors, say those who've gotten their PhDs in the last 10 years or so, seem to not know the history very well. Okay. So to them, to a large extent, even someone like Foucault and Derrida, I would say they've not read them very, very carefully. Instead, they've read postmodern works that were written in the 90s. And then anything that goes back to the 70s or even the 50s is almost like ancient history to them. And I would say, in my experience, is that they're not even that deeply read in Nietzsche or and certainly not going back to Marx. So there is a kind of shallowness there, but you might expect that because the idea that we need to study the old traditional texts and to take the history seriously and to get it right, that's not part of postmodernism taken seriously.
Yeah.
It's a much more, we're in a present focus now. The world is in a crisis. We need to be activists, and we need to be very action-oriented. So we don't really have much time for reflection and reading old dusty books and carrying on with arguments and counter-arguments.
I see.
So what's the point of that? So what is traditionally, the way I sometimes think of it is that we're now all into third generation postmodernists. The first generation, people like Foucault and Derrida, they were very well aware of the arguments and positions on the other side.
Okay.
And they were highly educated men, and they were making very sophisticated arguments for undercutting or deconstructing any sort of positive, rational or objective normative kind of claim that could be made. In the next generation, and this is now in the 80s and 90s, what you find is the postmodernists are very critical of the views that they are opposed to. But what they're arguing then is that since nobody really knows anything, that all we have is narratives, is that what we should be doing is having equal time for all of the other narratives that we've not heard. And so, we should be listening to, post-colonial narratives and Black voices and women's voices. And the idea then is that a well-educated person is going to be aware of all of the different voices that are out there without giving preference to one kind of voice over any other kind of voice or preferring any narratives, right, and so forth. But what we're now getting into then is in the third generation, kind of an impatience even with that, where the current postmoderns are saying, well, really, what's the point of reading other people's voices? We're never going to understand them anyway. We're never going to reach peaceful resolution. We're just going to read people who are speaking in our voice, read narratives that speak to our condition, and everything is just a power play anyway. And so we're going to use whatever power we have on campus to shut down and get rid of the different narratives and the different voices so that our narratives prevail.
Yes.
And that, of course, just brings with it an increasing intellectual shallowness, right? Because if you don't even know the other sides and the other positions, then you are, well, in my view, you're a semi-educated person, but that goes with the territory.
Yes. Okay, but that's actually a very good transition to my next question, because you've briefly mentioned the status of speech on American university campuses.
Yes.
And as you briefly hinted, it's become increasingly controlled and censored by what, well, there was this book in 94, Higher Superstition, and so the term the academic left was coined, so I think it's a very good one. So I'm going to use this one. So the academic left has been, from what I can see, increasingly controlling and censoring speech. So as far as I understand, this comes, this follows in very direct line from postmodernism, and this is what you've essentially confirmed already to some extent.
Yeah, absolutely.
It comes, among others, from their theories about reason and epistemology, since, as you said, they take the view that one cannot really, exchange ideas in a peaceful and rational way, but that there is always an underlying power play beneath the, the superficial arguments is the position, I guess.
Right.
One other source of this control on speech that I was able to identify is the famous essay by Herbert Marcuse, Repressive Tolerance.
Absolutely, right.
Yes.
Right. Very relevant to our current climate. And that's the explicit strategy as a result. would say that also ties into the earlier issue about the commonalities between the far right and the far left. So if you think about censorship issues over the course of history, one source of strong censoring has been the far right, sometimes on religious absolutist grounds.
Yes.
That we need to control speech and various forms of expression in the name of certain right principles. And now what we're finding is the far left is also arguing we need to control speech and limit certain forms of expression in the name of certain far left ideals. And so that's a very strong point of commonality right between them, because they both are fundamentally rejecting the real alternative, which is a deep liberalism, right, about speech. Marcuse is certainly relevant here. My view is that you mentioned Nietzsche earlier. Nietzsche argued that there is fundamentally no truth, that everything is will to power, power manifesting itself in various forms. And what power wants to do is dominate. And so if you come to believe that, and then Foucault really thought of himself mostly as a Nietzschean, and what you're going to do is use kind of power politics and power strategies on behalf of the groups that you identify with. So if as a kind of a left-wing postmodernist, you identify with various groups you take to be oppressed, then you're going to say, well, any sort of power politics methods are legitimate on behalf of the oppressed groups. And then if you think about speech, well, speech is a tool, speech is a weapon, speech is a form of social power, then you want to control speech as much as you can on behalf of your groups. And one way of doing that is by trying to monopolize any of the speech platforms or the speech outlets for your group alone, to try to deny access to those publishing outlets or speech outlets for groups that you are opposed to. So censorship on behalf of your group and censorship of the groups that you disapprove of is just straightforwardly part of your political strategy. So my view is that a lot of the talk about people's feelings being hurt and microaggressions, I think a lot of that just is a cover story. There aren't really any snowflakes, right, or people whose feelings are being hurt, and that we need to be protective and so forth. All of the people who are campus activists who are claiming these things, they browse the internet. They see the violent stuff that's going on. They've had bad love affairs. They know the horrible things that go on in the world. They're not tough. They're not shallow, tender people, right? They know what's going on. They can handle it. Instead, they're using that as a strategy for saying, anything that hurts our feelings, which is just really to say anything that we don't like, we're going to say, you can't say that, and the fact that it's going to hurt our feelings, that's just a cover story.
I see. Yeah, other people have hypothesized that maybe this wave of very strong control in speech might be due in part to things such as helicopter parenting. I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but
yes, certainly, yes.
Yes, or maybe it might come from mental health issues, which is what you've just addressed, actually. But as far as I was able to guess, my guess was indeed that it was really ideological.
Yeah, I think there are, of course, groups and subgroups. I think if you ask about the people who are the strategists, these are going to be the people who are now professors, who are professional activists, who are organizing the events, or people who are in graduate school or advanced undergraduates. Those people are no longer snowflakes, right? They know what they're doing. They have strategies, right? They have tactics. But I think it is also true if you think about many of the incoming first-year students, right, at universities. Many of them are, I think, impressionable. And for many students, adjustment to university life is a shock, and they can't handle it, and they, in many cases, are out of their depth. And so I think it is easy for activists to manipulate those students and to get them to be involved in various causes, right, in various ways.
Yes.
So the helicopter types or helicopter parenting types of explanations, I do think they have a place. It is true that many pre-college education system students are not getting a good education.
Okay.
So they do show up for university and they are not really prepared. So they do get overwhelmed. They are exposed to ideas that they've never had to be exposed to before, and that's hard for people to adapt to. They may have thought that they were, the smart kid in their class, and maybe they were the smart kid in their class, but they go to university and then they meet 100 other really smart kids who are just as smart as they are, who have really good arguments for all sorts of other things, and that's a blow to their ego. And they start losing arguments, and they're not sure that they can pass their courses. And so there are lots of defense mechanisms that are possible. And students, to the extent that they've been protected and coddled and not given a rigorous education and have had helicopter parents, they're going to find it the most difficult. And I do think those ones will be the most vulnerable to activists, professors, and brainwashing types of professors who know very well how to push their buttons and get them enrolled in various causes.
So with this campus climate in mind, what was the reception that you got for your book, actually, among your colleagues and maybe in your university?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I did have some difficulties getting the book published. It's several rejections. And what was, as it was going through peer process, typically editors send it out to two people. And there was a fairly common pattern where one reviewer would say, this is a very good book, strong argument, well done. And the other reviewer would say, this is a horrible book, bad argument, horribly done. So the editor would say no.
Okay.
When it was first published after several years, then it started doing well, through word of mouth. It got some good scholarly reviews. Some neutral outlets and also from some friendly outlets.
Okay.
Then some translations started to happen, Spanish and Portuguese and Persian and others and Swedish. And so it came to have some staying power. Now, what I noticed is that it's more, the audience has been people who are not postmodernists. And that's a broad group that includes conservatives and liberals who are not postmodernists.
Yes.
People who are sometimes socialists, but more old-fashioned socialists who actually believe that socialism describes objective ideals and the way the world should work. The only people I've not gotten direct engagement from are the postmodernists themselves. So everybody except the postmodernists, I've gotten, by and large, good reactions. Of course, I make a lot of strong claims in my book about all sorts of figures. So some of the people who are specialists will argue with me about this or that point of interpretation about Hegel or Nietzsche or Heidegger or whatever. But I've been overall very gratified with the book, and just the fact that it's still in print in multiple translations so many years later. That's good. I would say, though, I have gotten kind of an indirect compliment from the postmoderns in that postmodern journals will, a few times a year send me some article and just ask me for a review of it, knowing that I'm probably going to give it a fair but critical review.
Yeah.
So they know I'm out there and what I represent, but I've not gotten a direct response in any of the official postmodern journals.
I see. So my next question is more of a request, but it's not really a request, but halfway through, because I would ask you if you could rehearse the classification that you give in the last chapter of your book of the postmodern strategies. So essentially, you notice first that the postmodern theory of relativism, if you will, philosophical relativism, is in stark contrast with the practice of, authoritarianism, if you will, certainly on campus.
Sure.
So there is a contradiction there, and you sort of propose 3 ways to try and lift the contradiction. Well,
right.
You conclude that only 2 of them can be, likely answers, probably, but maybe I should let you explain.
Sure. So postmodernism is a very broad label, and there are many sub-variations on possible right within postmodernism, just as modernism is a very broad label, and modernists will disagree amongst each other on sub-issues. So I think one possibility is to say that one is a postmodernist, and that to you simply means that modernism's claims that we can be objective and through careful objectivity and scientific method come to actually know the truth about the world and make progress in our theoretical understanding of the world. So the thesis that there are no meta-narratives, that all we have are competing narratives and none of them is any better than any others. Mm-hmm. I think for some people it's true that that's all that postmodernism amounts to. So it's just a strict kind of a skeptical relativism epistemologically. Mm-hmm. And so that variation I call Kantian, right, postmodernism. So now that means buying into my view that Kant is amounts to a move in a counter-Enlightenment direction, and that's controversial. Mm-hmm. But that's one variation. But then there are other variations where there are normative issues that get bundled with that skeptical conclusion, and this is where your observation about the contradictions, right, come along. So you think, for example, say about many feminist, right, postmodernists, right. On one hand, you read feminist postmodernists, and they will give you the skeptical relativist story that all there are the narratives. Yes. There are male narratives and female narratives, and maybe those are bundled with various kinds of ethnic narratives and so forth. And nobody knows the truth, right, and so forth. But then at the same time, that gets bundled with very absolutist claims, that sexism is just plain wrong, right? It really is evil. And so they will speak in very absolutist, universalistic language in one breath, but at the same time, or is there in other breaths, be enunciating those relativistic narrative, right, types of things. And you'll find the same things among kind of race-based versions or ethnic-based versions, right, of postmodernism and so on. Or they will argue on the one hand, if nobody really knows the truth, then that seems, in one sense, that should point in a direction of a kind of tolerance. You have your narrative and I have my narrative, and why don't we just go our separate ways? But then that does not seem to materialize in practice in postmodernism. It's always that they want, in very authoritarian, political correct ways, to impose their narrative on everybody else and to demand everybody else accept that. So then there's a puzzle, right? How is it that they're all narratives, but say the Western Enlightenment narrative is just plain wrong? Mm-hmm. So are we to believe that the skepticism is deepest, or are we to believe that there's a value system or there's an ideological agenda that's the deepest, and that in some sense the narrative talk is a cover story? Yeah. So one way is to say, yes, it really is a cover story. And this is what I call Machiavellian postmodernism. So suppose you say, look, everything is just power. And the important thing is not whether who's right and who's wrong. It's just that you have your agenda, you have your goals, and we're all fighting amongst each other. And it's a political struggle for dominance, and you want your group to dominate. Mm-hmm. So how are you going to achieve that? You said, well, one way to do that, of course, is if you think about the stereotypical lawyer in a courtroom, you just want to win, right? It doesn't matter who's right and who's got justice on their side. And so you'll use any argument, fair or foul. You'll try to manipulate the facts. You'll omit certain other stories. You'll use plays on people's emotions and all of the cheap argument tricks. Anything that you think will work, including various skeptical narratives. It's not because you think that skepticism is true, but that because you think that if you can cast doubt on the other side's narratives, then your side's narrative has more of a chance. So your goal is to use skeptical strategies, but just in the service of your value agenda. So that's then to say, really what's going on is people who are postmodernists, they really believe that, say, capitalism and free markets and liberalism is bad, but what they want to do is just get people who might think that free markets or capitalism or liberalism has something going for it, use any skeptical arguments they can to undercut people's confidence in free market capitalism. So if, for example, we can say, well, look, the United States has its weaknesses, sure, but compare the economic productivity of the United States with the economic productivity of the Soviet Union, right? The facts are, the logic is that socialism has been a disaster and the free market countries have been very successful. All right, well, if you take facts seriously, well, then you have to believe that socialism is weak and capitalism is strong. But if you can then use a skeptical argument to say, well, everything is just a narrative, logic is just subjective, there are no such things as facts, to the extent that people believe that, well, then you can dismiss the data and the arguments, right, that put socialism in a negative light. So that's a possibility. So that's not Kantian postmodernism, that's a Machiavellian, right, kind of postmodernism. A third possibility is that there are some people who are, when they think about their political beliefs, that those political beliefs really amount to a kind of religious faith for them. And so, if you think of people who are religious, right, in the real sense, it's a fairly common phenomenon for intelligent young religious people who, when they were young, came to believe a certain set of views that they thought were noble and beautiful. But then when they start to think about them, come to realize, the arguments for their religion are kind of weak. There are really good arguments for maybe other religions or for not being religious at all. And so they're wondering, wow, maybe I should become agnostic or an atheist. And that is a kind of crisis of faith. And that's very uncomfortable for people to go through. But people who are going through a religious crisis of faith, they have to make a choice. You have to say, look, either I'm going to believe that I should go with the evidence and the arguments, and if my childhood religion really can't stand up to the arguments, and the evidence for it really isn't good, then I should change my mind and believe a more rational religion or not become religious at all. But that then is to say, I have to make a commitment to reason and argumentation and logic fundamental. But we do know that psychologically what a lot of people do when they have their crisis of faith is to say, I just don't want to change my mind. I want to believe my religion because it makes me feel good. It makes me feel beautiful. It gives me hope. And I don't want to consider having to believe anything else. And what we find in the case of those people psychologically is that they are the ones who will then say that reason is limited, that logic can only take you so far, that the most important things should be held emotionally and so forth. Now, if you translate that into political language, right, and if you think about the way we use socialism as an example here, right, socialism as a political philosophy functions in some people's minds as a kind of religion, right? They will, when they are young, adopt it, think that it describes the world beautifully, that it's noble, that it portrays this lovely view of how human beings can live in the future, and their identity and their emotional life becomes totally invested in socialism as an ideology. But then the same thing happens, right? If you start to then look seriously at the data, the history, the logical arguments against socialism, you look at the data for the non-socialist, more liberal free market societies on the other side, that can put a true believing socialist person in a kind of crisis. What am I going to do? And we do know that some people will then say, well, I have to go with the logic, I have to go with the evidence, and they then stop being socialist, right? Maybe they move to the middle of the road position, or some of them will become more liberal capitalists. Yeah. But the same thing can happen, that there's a kind of person who says, no matter what, I am so totally invested in my socialist worldview, I am not going to change my mind. It is going to be a matter of total faith for me. And what that means is that they need to find some way to reject the idea that evidence matters, that logic matters, and so forth. So all of the postmodern rhetorical strategies, right, about everything is just a narrative, are very welcome, because then if everything is just a narrative, you don't have to pay attention to the counter arguments. You don't have to pay attention for the data for liberalism. You can just, true your way, continue to believe your socialism. Now that I take to be a third variation, what I call it, that is Kierkegaardian postmodernism. Taking it from Kierkegaard, who is well known for arguing that in the face of contradiction, what you do need to do is make a passionate, right, emotional commitment in the face of all of the evidence, in the face of all of the arguments, into a belief system that seems to be absurd, because that's the only thing that can make your life authentic, right, and real. So I do think that some postmodernists use it as a way of kind of propping up their faith in some kind of left socialist, right, worldview that they have had a crisis over.
Very nice. Okay.
Yeah. Now the fourth possibility, right, then is to say, well, if you have a contradiction, is really just to embrace the contradiction, and say, I am advocating contradictory things, but I don't care. Right? I am just going to do what I want to do, and you end up with a kind of nihilism. And again, Nietzsche and to some extent Foucault are kind of upfront about this. Nietzsche diagnosing many of the nihilists, right, of his generation. And the way he put it was, there are lots of very intelligent, idealistic young people who came to realize that what they believed in was wrong and was taking them down the path of destruction. But they decided at that point that they just didn't care. And they embraced the nihilism and the destruction. And they were willing to destroy themselves and to destroy other people. And so I think what you find in many, right, young people is this willingness to be destructive just for the sake of destructiveness. That they don't have any positive vision, right? Any sense that really they're bringing about a more beautiful world. Instead, postmodernism is for them a way simply of being totally deconstructing. They're aware that people can do beautiful things, but they have bought into a worldview that is disappointing, and rather than admit that they were wrong and change their minds, they just embrace a kind of destructiveness.
I see. Okay. I just have one final question for you.
Sure.
So we've broadly agreed, I think, on the situation, certainly in the universities of the major English-speaking countries. One question which I'm trying to study at the moment, and I'm not sure how to do that, but I'm trying to understand how the postmodernist worldview is, how well it's doing in universities outside of the Anglosphere. So, for instance, in continental Europe. And I was wondering if you had some information about that.
Yeah, I would say first in the Anglo-speaking world, right, broadly speaking, postmodernism, I still think it's a minority movement.
Okay.
There are many parts of the university that are very healthy. You know, the natural sciences, much of the social sciences. In some of the social sciences, you'll find it's a prominent minority movement. Where things are most prominent are in some departments in the humanities and in many of the special studies departments, women's studies, ethnic studies, right, and so forth. And they do have a lock. And I would say even in the broader sociology, demographics of the university, they're a minority, but they do have to some extent a moral high ground.
I see.
And much more organized and much more activist. Many of other parts of the university, people are just trying to learn stuff and get good work done. So there's a bit of a vacuum that's being filled by the activists.
Yeah.
And they're being helped to some extent by administrators who, they don't like taking stands on things. They don't like to offend anybody. They're worried about lawsuits.
Yeah.
So they tend to bend over backwards and give them a lot of latitude. Outside of the Anglo-speaking world, my sense is the areas that I know best are kind of twofold. One is Latin America, and the other would be Eastern Europe.
Okay.
My sense is that Western Europe, things are healthier than in North America right now.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is, but it seems like the worst of postmodernism migrated across the Atlantic and now is in North America. To some extent, the Western European universities have moved on. Eastern European universities, when I've traveled there, and spoken with academics, there are postmodernists there, but they seem to be a very small minority. And my explanation for that is that the Eastern European universities, they lived under socialism for several generations.
Yes.
And so what they are now doing is rebuilding, and they see kind of the postmodernism being soft on Marxism, wanting to repackage various elements of left-wing thought as very disingenuous, right? They want to get on with their lives. And what they're doing is, they're looking at the data and they say, look, the Anglo-speaking world, Western Europe, to the extent that it's been liberal, has problems, sure. But it wasn't the Marxists and the socialists who did anything. It really was the Enlightenment, right? It was the liberals, it was the scientists, it was the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. It was the individualism and the toleration that made those countries successful, and we want to learn from them. And so they are trying as much as possible to learn from the Enlightenment and adapt it to the Eastern European circumstances. So I think in many respects, then the Eastern European intellectual world is a lot healthier. Yeah. The other part of the world I have some experience in is in Latin America, speaking at universities in Argentina, Chile, Guatemala, Brazil. And there, I think things are to a large extent even worse, right, than in North America. What you have there is mostly kind of warmed over left-wing thought, a lot of people who are explicit neo-Marxists, right, among the intellectuals or postmodernists. The only exceptions are the private universities, most of which are Catholic universities. And there you find more traditional Catholic social thought, right, in place. but you find very little understanding of the Enlightenment traditions, whether classical French Enlightenment thought or English or Scottish Enlightenment thought.
Yes.
And things are much more politicized. So my sense when I go to Latin America is that most intellectuals there, as intelligent as they are and as articulate as they are unfortunately half educated. They really only heard left-wing thought, and in some cases only left-wing postmodern thought. So things are unfortunately set there.
Okay, well, I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So now that's just one man's experience there. I think what we really would need is some good, demographic studies of what's going on in universities. But I don't know of any thorough studies of the intellectual belief systems of people in different parts of the world right now.
Well, there are some surveys in the United States, actually.
Yeah, there are some that I've noticed some that have been done of the philosophy profession.
Okay.
And interestingly, I think the philosophy profession is healthy. You don't find a lot of postmodernists actually in philosophy departments anymore. There are some departments that are, but by and large, even though the postmodern arguments came out of philosophy departments, the philosophers have moved on to other things and are relatively healthier.
Well, I think that was my last question. So.
All right. Well, a good range of questions. Yeah. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, it's a pleasure and an honor. So thanks for agreeing to do this.
All right. Me too. Yeah. Well, stay in touch and let me know when you publish.
Sure, I will.
Okay.
All right.
Bye for now.
Bye.